Officer Alex Turner sat in his old patrol car, feeling the low sound of the engine echoing through the seat. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the steering wheel, his eyes glued to the dark street outside. His shifts were often boring, and this part of the city had nothing but regular, repetitive patrols in the cold landscape of rundown buildings and long-closed stores. Long. Alex sighed, heavy and lifeless. He never really wanted to be here. His mind seemed to have left this place a long time ago. Ahead is a neighborhood full of people who don't care about improving their lives. People who always blame fate. He glanced quickly at the clock. There were 3 hours left until the end of his shift, and nothing could break the boredom. As he passed by a closed shop, a figure crossed his sight, a woman standing directly under the dim streetlight. She held a plastic bag in one hand. The other leaned on a stick. Her baggy coat covered her small body. The woman was like a ghost in the middle of the night, arousing doubt in his heart. Something about her stance made Alex uncomfortable. From long experience, he knows that appearances can be deceiving. This woman could be homeless or involved in something illegal. Without thinking long, he parked the police car on the sidewalk, his eyes never leaving her. Even though she was just standing there, occasionally shifting her weight from one foot to the other, in Alex's eyes, that was enough reason to be suspicious. Alex's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the exhilarating feeling of power. He liked the feeling of asserting his presence, of seeing respect in the eyes of others, or at least fear. And this woman, standing there, quiet and unflinching, was about to be reminded who controlled this place. He stepped out of the car, the sound of his shoes hitting the sidewalk loudly in the quiet night. The woman hardly reacted to his approach, not worried, not afraid, which made him feel even more uncomfortable. "What are you doing here?" Alex spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. The woman turned slowly, her deep, calm eyes looking at him over the brim of her hat. She said nothing, didn't move, and this only made Alex more upset. He moved closer, just a few steps away from her. Up close, she looks even older and more fragile. Her arms are thin, the deep wrinkles on her face, her faded clothes suggest poverty. "I'm asking you," Alex said, her tone sharp and authoritative, as if expecting an immediate answer. But the woman just looked at him, her eyes calm, almost serene, as if he had no impact on her at all. Her silence made him feel more frustrated. "Do you have identification documents?" Alex pressed his voice, trying to impose his presence. The woman quietly observed him. Her eyes seemed to penetrate all his insecurities. After a short moment, she spoke, her voice gentle but firm, resounding in the quiet night. Passers-by began to scatter, away from this confrontation for fear of being caught up in whatever might happen next. The yellow light from the street lamps cast long shadows on the cracked road surface, creating a gloomy and strange atmosphere like a distorted dream. Alex felt anger boiling every second. Margaret stood there, calm and collected, a blow to his ego. The feeling of control rushed through his fingers like water. His hand twitched, his fingers itching to do something to force her to react the way he wanted, fearful submission. But she just stood there, holding the cane indifferently, her eyes unwavering, filled with confidence that drove Alex crazy. "You're not from around here, right?" Alex stepped closer, his face just inches from hers. His breath blew out, hot and smelling of the coffee he drank all night to keep himself awake. Margaret did not waver. "I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you, officer," she replied, her voice calm but strong. "I know every street here better than almost anyone else." Alex clenched his jaw. This was not the answer he wanted to hear. He wanted her to be afraid, wanted her to show signs of awareness of his power. But instead, she talked as if there was nothing to worry about. "In that case, you should know better than to wander around here in the middle of the night," Alex growled. "You know what can happen around here, right? This isn't safe for someone like you." Margaret looked straight into his eyes, her eyes unwavering. "I've seen worse things than you can imagine, officer," she replied calmly, "and standing in front of a policeman is not one of them." Her words were like a slap to Alex's pride, although he didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was the way she said those things, calm, collected, as if she didn't need to prove anything. That only made Alex's anger flare stronger. Alex took another step forward, to the point where their shoes were almost touching. He could clearly see the wrinkles on her face, her silver hair peeking out from under the wide brim of her hat. She looked tired but not weak, and this infuriated him. "Do you know this, old woman?" he said, his voice low and full of indignation. "You have no right to talk to me like that. You don't get to stand here and act like you're above the rules. You don't get to disrespect me." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her lips pursed into a thoughtful line, her eyes actually looking deeply into Alex, as if she were searching for something behind his angry shell. Her silence made Alex even more uncomfortable, as if she could see through the police cover, the badge, see something he didn't want to admit. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice low but clear. "I don't disrespect you, officer. I'm just not afraid of you." Those words were like a knife to Alex's self-esteem. His vision became blurry with rage, his jaw clenched painfully. How dare she stand there and tell him she wasn't afraid? To him, a police officer, this was not just a personal insult, but a challenge to everything he stood for. "You should be afraid of me," Alex said, his voice a growl, almost a whisper, his hand twitching near his waist where the flashlight dangled like a veiled threat. "You don't know who you're kidding." Margaret glanced down, catching a glimpse of the movement of his hand, but she did not step back. She just looked at him, her eyes quiet, as if she understood him completely better than he understood himself. Without blinking, Margaret looked straight at Alex and said softly, "You don't know who you're dealing with, Officer Turner." Immediately, Alex's stomach twisted. The way she said his name, his full name, made him feel uneasy. "How did she know your name?" Alex never introduced himself. This feeling is like being slapped in the face by someone. He told himself that maybe she just saw the name tag. But that brief moment of doubt, a tiny seed of fear, had sprouted in his mind, leaving him confused as he tried to maintain his composure. "Do you think you're so smart?" Alex spat every word, contempt filling his voice. "You think you can stand here, talk to me like that, like you're better than me?" Margaret remained calm, her voice gentle but maddeningly firm. "I never thought like that, officer. I just want to go home." Alex suddenly moved closer. There was almost no distance between them. "You are lying. I know who you are. I see it in your eyes." Margaret's eyes did not waver. "What do you see in my eyes, Officer Turner?" Alex opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time he felt confused. "What do you see in her eyes?" "I don't know." The only thing he was sure of was that she didn't react the way he expected, without fear, and that made him lose his cool, made him feel weak, as if his badge and uniform were no more meaning. "You can't just leave after disrespecting me," he said, his voice trembling slightly, betraying the underlying anger. "You will. Learn your place, and I will make sure of it." Margaret remained silent, her eyes fixed on him, as if she were carefully considering his every move. She did not openly challenge him, but her calmness, her refusal to submit, was a challenge to herself. "Why are you doing this?" Alex asked, his voice growing louder with frustration. "Why do you act like you are untouchable? I could arrest you right now, and no one would care." Margaret replied quietly, "You could, but would that make you feel better?" This question surprised Alex. His fists clenched, his knuckles turning white as he tried to suppress his anger. How can she stay so calm? Alex's heart pounded in his chest, the beat accelerating as each moment seemed to stretch into hours. He wanted to do something, anything that would disrupt her composure, make her react. But she said nothing, did nothing, as if she understood him clearly. And that scared him more than anything. "You won't get away with this," he said, his voice shaking. "I will make sure of that." But even as he spoke those words, for the first time in his career, Alex felt their emptiness. He wasn't sure what would happen next, didn't know if he was still in control of the situation. The atmosphere was as tense as it could be cut around them. The street was still silent, but the confrontation between Alex and Margaret seemed to weigh heavily on his chest, like a boulder he couldn't brush away. Adrenaline rushed through her body, preparing for something, but she still stood still, her eyes watching him, expressionless. And in that moment, Alex felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. For the first time, he questioned his motives, his role in the situation. That doubt is scarier than anything else. Alex's breathing became rapid and shallow. The distance between him and Margaret was now thick with wordless tension. His mind whirled between conflicting impulses. He wasn't used to this, not used to someone standing up to him, especially someone as vulnerable and submissive as her. Something inside him seemed to have broken. He couldn't bear the feeling of helplessness when a small, older woman could face him without flinching. Without thinking, his hand reached out, grabbed Margaret's thin arm, and pulled her towards him forcefully. Her body jerked towards him, pain flashing across her face. But she didn't make a sound, her hand still holding the groceries tightly, the cane wobbling slightly as she tried to keep her balance. "Do you think you can stand here and talk to me like that?" Alex hissed, his voice low and venomous, squeezing her arm. "You think I'm going to let you leave after disrespecting me?" Margaret looked down at his hand, squeezing her arm, then looked up with a steady gaze. Her gaze didn't falter, and that only made Alex angrier. He expected her to cry, apologize, beg him to let her go, but she did nothing. "Let me go," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Alex's hand tightened, feeling her fragile bones under his fingers. A part of his mind told him to stop, but that part was quickly drowned out by anger. Mrs. Margaret kept her gaze steady, speaking with a terrifying calmness. "Is this really about me, Officer Turner, or is it about yourself?" That sentence was like a sharp blade, cutting deeply into Alex's self-esteem. His heart was pounding, blood rushing to his face. "You know nothing about me," he growled, his voice shaking with rage. She remained, silent as a harsh response, as if she didn't need to say anything more, as if her look was enough to point out everything he didn't want to admit. Margaret looked deeply into Alex's eyes, as if seeing the insecurity hidden behind his anger. She was not afraid of him, not of his badge, of his power, or of his threats. That made Alex feel scared. "I won't say it again," his voice said, louder, but now sounding somewhat cracked by his own lack of certainty. "You should cooperate, otherwise things will get much worse." Margaret remained still, without resistance, her eyes still calm, and she said in a cold voice, "You've been out of control since you laid your hands on me, Officer Turner." Her words were like a strong punch to Alex's mind, making all his thoughts stagger. Anger exploded as he raised his hand, unrestrained, and threw a punch. It happened in the blink of an eye. The punch was stronger than he thought. His fist slammed into Margaret's face, sending her tumbling backwards. She stumbled and the stick fell to the ground. Her shopping bag spilled over, boxes of canned goods and loaves of bread rolled down the sidewalk. Alex stood there, his fists still clenched, his breathing heavy and uneven. The sound of the punch echoed in his head, echoing in the quiet street. Margaret knelt down, hands on the ground to maintain balance, and slowly regained her stance. She did not scream, just wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand. Her eyes remained steadfast. A feeling of satisfaction washed over Alex. Sick joy at seeing her finally back down. But that feeling dissipated as soon as her gaze returned. Margaret's eyes remained calm, but now sparkled with something new, cold, a deep disappointment. "You will regret doing this," Margaret said softly, her voice gentle, but carrying undeniable weight. A shiver ran down Alex's spine, the cold cutting through his heart like a knife. He tried to respond, tried to say something to regain control, but no words came out. His throat was tight, as if choked by fear. Suddenly, Margaret reached into her coat pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. Alex's instincts kicked in. His hand went towards the gun, his fingers curled tightly around the handle, his eyes never leaving her movements. For a moment, he thought she might be drawing a weapon, but instead, Margaret slowly pulled out a black leather purse, flipping it open with a practiced movement. Inside was an FBI badge glistening under the streetlight. Alex was stunned, his breath choking as his eyes stared at that gold and silver badge, unable to believe what he was seeing. "I'm Special Agent Margaret Hill," she said softly, her voice quiet and more intimidating than any threat. "And Officer Turner, You just made a huge mistake. Alex's world seemed to spin, panic struck, hitting every cell, making him tremble. His hand dropped from the gun and fell to his side. He stared at the woman he had just attacked, a federal agent. The truth of what he had done washed over him like a cold tide. His mind panicked, trying to find a way out, an apology, a way to erase what had happened. But there was no way. He couldn't take back that punch. He couldn't erase the fact that he had assaulted an FBI agent. Everything seemed to collapse, his career, his authority. Everything was now hanging on a fragile thread in the quiet night on that deserted street. Margaret's eyes followed Alex. Her eyes were calm, but authoritative. She took a step towards him. Her voice was calm, but sharp. You will be responsible for what happened. What was done? Alex's stomach clenched. His knees felt like they were about to give out. His mind screamed, wanting to run away before it was too late. But his body seemed frozen, weighed down by his own actions. Margaret's calm voice was like a sharp blade, cutting through his thoughts, reminding him of his terrible mistake. From afar, Alex could hear the sirens getting louder and louder, getting closer by the second. His heart raced, his hands trembled as he looked at the woman he had just attacked. No longer an elderly stranger, but an FBI agent who held his fate in his hands. Alex stood motionless, eyes glued to the FBI badge in Margaret's hand, as if it were a snake waiting to strike. The sounds of sirens gradually grew louder, but Alex seemed to hear nothing but the erratic beating of his heart. His hands hovered near his waist, unconsciously looking for a way out, but all his thoughts were suppressed by the harsh truth. He had just punched a federal agent. Margaret stood quietly, her face showing no anger, but instead a calmness as if waiting for the inevitable. You don't understand, Alex muttered, his voice shaking. This should not have happened. Margaret did not answer immediately, but just looked at him, her eyes weighing on him like an invisible force. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but sharp. You made it happen, Officer Turner. I made a choice. Alex's jaw clenched. The space became stuffy with the familiar sound of the siren, now sounding like a death cry. Each flashing light made him feel shivers. I don't know, Alex began, his voice hoarse, trying to explain, but Margaret interrupted with cold precision. You don't have to know who I am. What matters is that you attacked a federal agent. Alex stood there, confused and angry. This moment was unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Somehow, everything turned upside down. Margaret took another step forward, her eyes never leaving him. You think you're above the law, don't you? She said, her voice as soft as a whisper. You have been doing this for too long, using your power to oppress others. Alex felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to scream, to refute her words, but the weight of the truth weighed heavily on his shoulders. I'm just a cop doing my job, he muttered, his voice sounding hollow, even to himself. Margaret interrupted his thoughts. I have been monitoring your department for a while. Her voice was calm, but authoritative. You're not the only one. This corruption is deep-rooted, and you are part of it. Alex's eyes widened. His heart skipped a beat. He had heard rumors about a federal investigation, but no one thought an undercover agent would target him. He wanted to object, but Margaret didn't give him a chance. I didn't think anyone would hold me responsible, but I was wrong. Her words were like heavy stones pressing down, pulling him into a deep pit of fear and panic. He had punched her, had crossed the line, and now Margaret held all the power in the palm of her hand. Alex mumbled lowly, her voice weak. That's not what I wanted, but Margaret replied with no sympathy in her voice. But that's what happened, and now you will have to face the consequences. The sirens were now almost deafening. Alex turned his head and saw black SUVs and police cars stopping around the corner. A group of FBI agents stepped out of an SUV, followed by police officers. Alex choked, staring at Margaret as she stood still, FBI badge in hand, waiting for her colleagues to appear. A tall agent with a stern face walked up to Margaret, nodding respectfully. Agent Hill, are you okay? He asked. Margaret nodded. I'm fine. I have all the evidence I need. Alex's eyes fell on Margaret, and for the first time, he noticed a small device attached to her collar. A miniature camera, almost imperceptible. Alex's breath caught. Everything, his attack, the threats, was recorded. Alex muttered, "You set a trap for me." That realization hit him like a train straight into his mind. Margaret just looked at him, her eyes calm and unblinking, making him feel scared from the first moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice monotone and cold. Margaret looked at Alex calmly, her voice cold and sharp. "There is no need to set a trap for you, Officer Turner." He pushed himself in when he decided to abuse his power. "All I did was give you the opportunity to reveal your true nature." Alex felt cold sweat break out on his forehead, his temples pounding. He always thought he was untouchable, that the badge allowed him to act as he wanted. But in just a few short minutes, everything around him collapsed. Other agents began to move around him, faint voices seeming to echo from afar. An agent approached, grabbed Alex's hand, and pulled his arm behind his back. Alex didn't resist. His mind was numb, overwhelmed by the weight of his mistakes. The cold feeling of handcuffs tightened around his wrists, and for the first time in his life, Alex Turner felt what it was like to be on the other side of the law. The irony is not lost on him. A man who has handcuffed hundreds of people throughout his career is now a handcuffed man, standing helplessly in the midst of the law. As he was led toward the police car, he glanced over his shoulder and saw Margaret still standing there, her face calm as if this were just a normal day at work. Before he was pushed into the car, Margaret spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for Alex to hear every word. "This isn't just your problem, Officer Turner. This is a problem for your entire department, your entire system. We will handle it all." Alex's heart sank. He thought the nightmare was over, but when the car door closed and the agents turned back to chat with Margaret, he realized that this was only the beginning. Alex sat in the police car, handcuffs biting his wrists, his mind a storm of fear and confusion. Inside the car was stuffy. The air smelled of old leather and sweat. He couldn't stop replaying the events that had just happened. The confrontation, the punch, the badge. The reality that Margaret was not just a stranger, but an undercover FBI agent stunned him. And with each passing second, the weight of what he had just committed grew heavier. The police car jerked when it hit a pothole, causing Alex to snap out of his thoughts. Looking out the window, he saw familiar streets passing by and flashing lights. This used to be his domain, where he felt he controlled everything, but now everything seemed strange, as if he were looking from the other side of the law. The thought of what awaited made his stomach turn. He had seen officers who overstepped their bounds get arrested. Some were lucky enough to escape with just a slap on the hand, but others lost everything. But this was no small scandal. He assaulted an FBI agent, and it was all recorded. As the car stopped slowly outside the detention area, flashing red and blue lights reflecting on the wall of the building, Alex felt his heart beating strongly. How can I come back here? He had walked through this door hundreds of times, taking pride in his role as a law enforcer. But now, his position has been reversed. He is no longer an officer, but a criminal. The back door of the patrol car opened, and a young, unfamiliar officer signaled Alex to get out. Alex hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. It was difficult to get out, but the police officer grabbed his arm and led him out of the car. As he stood up, the reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. The cold cuffs tightened around the wrists. Each step towards the entrance to the area felt heavy. This time, walking through the entrance was not the same as usual. It contained an extreme horror. As Alex approached the reception desk, his heart beat loudly, and he knew that from here on out, things would never be the same again. Heads turned as the officers and staff in the precinct realized who was being escorted in, whispers spreading throughout the room like a silent storm. The name Turner was mentioned, along with eyes glued to him. Colleagues who had worked with him, shared happy moments, and even admired him. "What the hell is going on?" someone muttered, their voice filled with confusion. "Turner in handcuffs?" another voice whispered. Alex tried to avoid people's eyes as he was led through the crowded area, feeling every step was a painful reminder of what was happening. He bowed his head, refusing to look anyone in the eye. When arriving at the processing area, Alex was pushed to sit on a chair in front of a thick glass partition. The police officer led him aside, replaced by a processing worker who was used to dealing with hardened criminals, not an officer. He stared at Alex with an awkward expression before opening his mouth, his voice even and professional. Name? Alex swallowed, his mouth dry. Alex Turner, he muttered, barely able to speak. The officer made a note on his clipboard and continued. You know the procedure. Charges are pending, but assaulting a federal agent is serious. Alex's throat tightened. He wanted to explain, but what could he say? He did exactly what the policeman said, and now has to face the consequences. You will be kept in this cell until they figure out what to do, the officer continued, without looking up. You will be transferred to federal custody soon. Currently, you are our guest. The word guest sounded ironic, because Alex knew he was no longer a guest. He was a prisoner. After being fingerprinted and photographed, Alex was led through the narrow hallway to his cell. He had passed through this hallway many times, but this time it felt claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in around him. The echo of the cell door lock echoing through the walls made Alex shiver, a cold feeling penetrating every cell. The door opened, and he was pushed inside. The door slammed shut behind him. The sound of the lock rang in his ears. And for the first time in his life, Alex Turner was locked in a cell. He stood still for a moment, letting the terrible reality seep into his every thought. The room is small and narrow, with a shabby bed against the wall, an open sink and toilet. The surrounding walls were covered in graffiti, scratched and dirty. Alex sat down heavily on the bed, his head bowed in his hands. The handcuffs were still biting his wrists tightly, his mind racing to find a way out of this situation, searching for any reason that could save him. But there was no choice. He couldn't escape the consequences now. The silence in the cell was broken only by distant footsteps and whispered voices. Alex's thoughts jumped back and forth between anger and fear, between doubt and regret. He wanted to blame someone, Margaret, the FBI, anyone but himself. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was all his fault. His temper controlled him, and now he must pay the price. After what seemed like an eternity, footsteps sounded, and Alex looked up to see a familiar face, Lieutenant Greg Hanlon, his immediate superior. Hanlon stood in front of the bars, his arms crossed over his chest, his stern face mixed with disappointment. What the hell happened, Turner? Hanlon finally spoke, his voice low, but filled with anger. Alex opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know. Alex hesitated, his voice hoarse. I didn't know she was FBI. I didn't know things would go this far. Hanlon narrowed his eyes, his voice heavy. Didn't know she was FBI, or didn't know that you had crossed the line? Alex felt the weight of the question. The air between them seemed to freeze. I didn't mean for it to turn out like that, Alex muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Hanlon shook his head, his face hardening. It doesn't matter anymore, Turner. What matters is what you did, and you will have to face the consequences. The last feeling of hope disappeared in Alex's heart. Hanlon was right. There was no turning back. No excuses, no explanations can change what happened. I'm sorry, Alex whispered, his words interrupted. Hanlon looked at him for a long time, his eyes unpredictable, then turned away, leaving Alex alone in the cell with regret, guilt, and the sound of the cell door slamming behind him. Hanlon's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he left, leaving Alex lying back on the bed, head in hand, into the oppressive silence of the cell. At the same time, Agent Margaret Hill sat across from the rest of the team in a makeshift FBI office. Overhead fluorescent lights illuminate the cramped, sterile, windowless space. This is a camouflage facility located deep in the city center area. Boards filled with photos, documents, and detailed maps hang on the walls, recording the results of the months-long investigation. In the middle of the room, documents were piled up on the table, scattered, marking clues that were still being uncovered. Margaret leaned back in her chair, feeling the fatigue from that evening's events weigh heavily on her shoulders. The pain wasn't just from Alex Turner's punch. Her cheek is still sore and bruised, but also the emotional pain of a mission that reached its climax after weeks of working undercover, trying to gather evidence and verify the truth. Opposite Margaret is Special Agent in Charge Daniel Harris, her supervisor. Harris, a tall man with a stern appearance and sharp eyes, always calculates every move, always thinking 2 steps ahead. He has worked in the bureau for decades, his experience shows in every decision, and his composure inspires the team, even in the most difficult situations. He glanced at Margaret, his eyes confusing but containing concern. "Are you okay, Hill?" he asked, his voice low but determined. Margaret nodded, even though the burning pain in her cheek was still there, reminding her of the recent collision. "I'm fine. It's nothing I haven't dealt with before." Harris studied her for a moment before nodding slightly. "That punch, Hill, was quite a challenge, but you handled it well. Thanks to you, we have collected all the necessary evidence." Margaret replied, her voice calm but filled with exhaustion. "If it wasn't for that punch, we wouldn't have what we needed." The room was silent for a moment, her words hanging in the air. The confrontation between Margaret and Turner is not only the end of a mission, but also a confrontation with bitter reality. "You were right about Turner all along," Harris said, tapping her pen on the edge of the table. "We always knew there were problems in that department, but Turner is worse than we thought." Margaret sighed, feeling the weight of the entire investigation on her shoulders. She spent weeks immersed in Turner's area of operation, playing the role of an elderly woman, quietly observing how Turner and other officers treated residents. Day by day, Margaret witnesses the abuse of power, the way officers like Turner not only carry out their duties, but also deliberately seek reasons to assert personal power. The agents on Margaret's team nodded in agreement. They have all seen the signs of officers like Turner who believe they are untouchable. This problem is not just one bad cop, but an entire culture that has been allowed to exist unchecked for too long. "We have all the evidence," Harris said, his voice breaking the silence. The video recording from her body camera, the audio recordings, and the statements she collected were all more than enough to conclude this case. Turner's actions tonight sealed his fate. Margaret nodded, but her thoughts were far ahead of Turner. He is just a piece of the bigger picture. Turner's actions were serious, but they were only symptoms of a deeper problem. She knew there were other officers in the department who assisted Turner, or worse, encouraged him to abuse their power. "This isn't just about Turner," Margaret said, her voice even but filled with deep disappointment. "It's a whole system. Turner is just on the surface, but underneath is a deeply ingrained culture, and we need to tackle it at the root." The team was silent, well aware of the importance of the work they were undertaking, not just to capture an individual, but to begin a much-needed reform. Harris looked around the room, his eyes stopping on each face of his team, then nodded. "We will do everything to bring this case to light. And not just Turner, but the entire department will have to face its responsibility. This corruption runs deep, and I'm not sure we've uncovered it all," Margaret said, her voice filled with tension. Harris nodded, his eyebrows furrowed. "We've been following some other officers. Turner may be the most prominent player, but we know he didn't act alone. This situation extends to higher ranks, and Lieutenant Hamlin has been on our radar for some time. His traces are everywhere." When she heard about Hamlin, Margaret felt a surge of anger. She observed Hamlin carefully throughout his time working undercover. He was much more discreet than Turner, but his complicity was unmistakable. "Hamlin has protected Turner for years," Margaret said, her voice filled with disappointment. "Every complaint about Turner was buried or dismissed. I believe Hamlin received compensation, although we do not have clear evidence yet." Harris tapped his pen on the table, his mind pondering the next steps. "We need to be careful. If you strike too early, it will make Hamlin and the others wary. But now that they have arrested Turner, the pressure will be on them. They know we're getting close." Margaret glanced at the files on her desk, each file a story of injustice, a life affected by officers like Turner in a system that did not protect the people. "We have to get it right this time," she said, her voice soft but determined. "We have to make sure that when we knock them out, there's no going back, no more slaps on the wrist, no more deals." Harris looked at her with a steady gaze. "That is the plan, but it will take time. We have Turner, and once he understands the situation, he will give us what we need to take down Hamlin and his co-conspirators." Margaret wasn't so sure. She had met people like Turner before, people who believed they were invincible, clinging to power even as it slowly slipped from their grasp. It won't be easy for Turner to give up on his colleagues, but Harris is right. They have the upper hand. Now Turner is in custody, and with evidence in hand, There is no way out for him. As the team continues to discuss their next steps, Margaret recalls her confrontation with Turner. She knew that the encounter would be tense, but she didn't expect him to explode so easily. It reminded her how dangerous people like Turner can be when their power is threatened. She unconsciously raised her hand to her cheek, which was still sore and bruised, but it wasn't the punch that stuck in Margaret's mind. It was Turner's hatred, and the way he was willing to resort to violence when he was in power. His power is challenged. Harris's voice pulled Margaret out of her thoughts. "Are you okay?" he asked again, this time more gently. Margaret nodded, although the heavy feeling still weighed on her. "I'm fine," she replied, but the words sounded hollow. "It's just that I think about how much work remains to be done." Harris nodded. "We'll do it. It will take time, but we will bring it all to light." Margaret wanted to believe in him. She had to believe for the people who were hurt, for the families who endured abuse from officers like Turner, and for the corrupt system that protected them. She had to believe that they would win, even though deep down she knew that even if Turner and Hanlon were defeated, the war would continue. There will always be others like them, and the fight for justice will not end here. When the meeting ended, Margaret packed up the documents and stuffed them in her bag as the other team members gradually dispersed. She stood for a moment, staring at the pinboard of officers, victims, and witnesses, each a part of a larger story, a system broken from the inside. She took a deep breath, then turned away, determined to focus on the next phase of the campaign. Turner has been detained, but the real work has only just begun. Meanwhile, Alex Turner sat alone in an empty cell, his back against the cold concrete wall. The dim fluorescent light emitted a buzzing sound like mental torture. The room had no windows, no clock, and the sense of time was completely gone. Mixed in the air with the smell of bleach was the smell of his own sweat, lingering on his now wrinkled and faded uniform. Even though the handcuffs had long since been removed, he still felt their pressure around his wrists. Alex's mind whirled between anger, fear, and disbelief, endlessly replaying the moment when he threw his punch at Margaret Hill, a punch that turned into the dull sound of terrible impact. Alex had convinced himself that he had control, that he was the one with the power in the situation. But now, everything got out of hand from the moment he laid his hands on her. How did things get this far? That question kept circling in his mind. He had crossed a line from which he could never return, a line that marked the end of his career, his reputation, and the life he had known. Alex Turner assaulted a federal agent, Margaret Hill. Alex felt fear rising as he thought about the woman in front of him, an FBI agent who had been following him, who had set the perfect trap, drawing him deeper and deeper into the web. Not until he fell. And now, he is sitting in a prison cell, waiting for his fate to be decided by the colleagues he once trusted. The door to the holding area creaked, and footsteps echoed down the hallway, each step closer making his heart pound. Unconsciously, he expected a familiar face, perhaps Lieutenant Hamlin, to come to give some assurance. But the figure that appeared was not any of his colleagues, but Margaret Hill. Margaret stood at his cell door, flanked on either side by FBI agents in dark suits. A dark bruise was visible on his cheek, where his fist had left its mark. She stood straight, her eyes without a trace of pity or anger, only coldness and determination. Alex's mouth was dry. He tried to say something, but every word was choked. He had attacked Margaret, and now she stood here, holding his future in her hands. One of the agents unlocked the cell door, a metallic sound echoing in the small space. The door opened, and Alex's heart beat stronger than ever when he saw Margaret enter. Margaret crossed the cell threshold and approached Alex, her eyes never leaving him. Her gaze was so strong that it sent chills down Alex's spine. The two stood facing each other in a silent battle of wills. Alex tried to stay calm, but his confidence seemed to melt, like sand slipping through his fingers. "You look terrible," Margaret said, her voice small but sharp. Alex blinked, surprised that her tone contained no anger or scolding, only an unpredictable calm. His voice was hoarse. He had to clear his throat to continue. "I didn't mean for things to turn out like this." Margaret tilted her head, her eyes sharp and determined. "You don't mean to hit me?" Didn't mean to lose control and attack a federal agent. Alex opened his mouth, but couldn't say anything. He had no excuses, couldn't deny the fact that she had seen it all. Yes, she provoked him, but he chose to throw the punch himself. I don't know who you are, he muttered, his voice almost pleading. Margaret interrupted him, her voice sharp as a knife. Just an old woman you thought might be a threat, someone you thought was unimportant. Alex's jaw tightened. He looked away, unable to bear Margaret's eyes. She was right, of course. He thought Margaret was just an ordinary person, appearing at the wrong time and in the wrong place. He didn't care who she was. He only cared that she dared to challenge his authority. Do you know how many complaints have been filed against you? Margaret asked, her voice sharp, the weight of her anger clear in every word. How many times have you crossed the line and thought you'd never get caught? Alex was silent. There was no need to answer, because he knew full well that the complaints had been piling up for so long. But he was always shielded, always thinking he couldn't be hurt. Touch! Hitherto. Margaret took a step closer, her face just inches from his. You think you're special, right? She said, her voice cold and sharp. You think you're different, that the law doesn't apply to you. Alex felt anger rising in his chest. He had always been taught that he was special, the tough cop this city needed. But now, in front of Margaret Hill, all of that was meaningless. I'm doing my job, Alex replied, his voice harsher than he intended. I keep the streets safe. Margaret narrowed her eyes dangerously. Safe for whom? People like you? Or the people who hold you responsible? The people who don't accept you when you decide to take control of their lives? Alex clenched his fists, his muscles tensing, Margaret's words piercing him, reminding him that his power was gone, and control was beyond his reach. You think this is just about you? Margaret continued, her voice ringing strongly. Do you think you're all we're looking for? You're just one part of a bigger problem, a system that's been rotting away from the inside for years, and you're just one small piece of the puzzle. Alex stood there, silent, his heart heavy as he realized everything. The days of considering oneself invulnerable are over. Now, before him was a war that he never thought he would lose, and he was the one who single-handedly caused that defeat. Alex clearly felt the tension in the air as Margaret spoke. It seems like something bigger is being planned, and he learns that he not only faces charges of assaulting an agent, but is also caught up in a whirlwind that has the potential to destroy his entire career. Yours and the whole department. What do you want from me? Alex asked, his voice trembling and mixed with anger. Margaret looked at him silently for a long time, her cold eyes showing no emotion. She crossed her arms over her chest and replied simply, I want you to talk. I want you to tell me everything you know about Hanlon and the other officers involved. I want names, dates, details. Alex's heart ached when he heard about Hanlon, his mentor, his superior, and also the man who always stood up to protect him. Hanlon taught him how to navigate the agency's murky waters, shielding any complaints against him. Betraying Hanlon is like cutting off your own arm. I can't, Alex whispered, shaking his head. Margaret's eyes were cold and unforgiving. You have no choice, Turner. He is facing federal charges for assaulting an FBI agent, and this is not something that can be handled lightly. He will face serious imprisonment. Your career is over. Alex's heart beat strongly. Margaret's every word seemed to hit him in the head. His career, everything he had built, had gone up in smoke. But betraying Hanlon, who was almost like a father to him, was hard to bear. If you cooperate, we can give you some relief, Margaret continued, her voice softening slightly. But if you stay silent, you will endure it all alone. When you sit in federal prison, you will realize how costly loyalty can be. Alex's mind reeled with conflicting emotions. Everything he has built is crumbling, and Margaret is holding out a lifeline for him. But it comes at a price he's not sure he can pay. I need time, he whispered, almost to himself. Margaret's expression remained cold and hard. You don't have much time, Turner. The walls are closing in. You can help us bring down the rest of this corrupt system, or go down with them. The decision is yours. With that, she turned away, leaving Alex alone in the stuffy room, silence falling as the door slammed shut behind her. News of The arrest of Officer Alex Turner spread like fire in the wind, covering all media, from local radio stations to national newspapers. A series of headlines about police brutality and officer attacks FBI agent dominate the news pages. The public was seething with a series of protests outside the police station, demanding an end to police brutality and corruption. Outrage gripped the community, and a growing sense that this was not just about Alex Turner, but about a whole system that tolerated abuses of power without accountability. Margaret stood in front of a row of televisions in the FBI's temporary office, watching the news with the image of her bruised face. Although the physical wounds are slowly healing, the emotional pain from the confrontation with Turner is still strong. She risked everything working in a dangerous environment full of discrimination, but in the end, everything paid off. Audio recordings, videos, and testimonies from victims have exposed the system's icebergs. Now, Turner is just the beginning. Other officers will soon face justice as well. Harris, Margaret's supervisor, approached, crossed his arms, and looked at the screen. "This case is bigger than we thought," he said quietly. "These protests aren't just about Turner, they're about the entire police department." Margaret nodded. The community has endured this oppression for many years. Turner is not the only one. This is an opportunity for all voices to be heard. Harris looked at her, his expression worried. "Do you think things will get worse?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "That's right. Once we pull this thread, it reveals the entire system. And we will encounter resistance from both inside and outside the police department." Harris sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of what was about to happen. "We are prepared for this, but it will be a fierce battle. We need Turner to cooperate. It's our best chance to bring down the leaders." Margaret kept staring at the screen. "He will cooperate," she said in a monotone voice. He knew what was about to happen and knew he couldn't face it alone. "He will speak." But even as she said that, Margaret understood that it would not be easy. Turner is loyal to the system that has protected him for years, loyal to Hanlon, who has always shielded him from consequences. Breaking this loyalty requires more than the threat of prison, but also requires Turner to face who he really is and what he has become. As the news continued to report on the incident, Margaret's phone suddenly vibrated. She picked it up and saw a text message from one of the agents on the team. "Hanlon is watching your every move. Be careful." Margaret squinted her eyes, sensing the danger in the text message. She knew that Hanlon was smart and cunning, with enough experience to cover his tracks. But now, with Turner in custody and the investigation winding down, Hanlon has become a desperate man, easily making dangerous choices when trying to protect himself. Lieutenant Greg Hanlon stood in his office, staring through the closed curtain that separated him from the chaos outside. The sounds of the protests echoed through the glass. Only muffled chants, sometimes mixed with car horns and helicopters soaring overhead. Hanlon clearly feels the pressure surrounding him. Over the years, he has tried to keep things under control, giving officers like Turner enough freedom to act without strict supervision. Hanlon quietly covered up the complaints, orchestrating internal investigations to ensure his boys could continue the work he considered essential. But now everything is falling apart. Turner, with his impulsive personality, could not control himself, and as a result, he punched an undercover FBI agent in the face. That punch was clearly recorded on camera, and there was no way to cover up what happened this time. Turner had crossed the line, and now the entire department was under a microscope. Hanlon's office phone suddenly rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID, realizing it was one of the contacts at City Hall. Hanlon hesitated before picking up the phone. "It's Hanlon," he said, his voice dry. "Lieutenant, we have a problem." The voice on the other end sounded worried. "The mayor's office is requesting a comprehensive internal investigation into your department. They will bring in independent investigators from outside to monitor the entire process. And if not handled quickly, this could be a major overhaul." Hanlon tightened his grip on the phone, his knuckles turning white as he felt the situation become dire. Such an investigation would expose all the dark dealings, all the cover-ups he has carried out over the years. If the public knew, not only Turner but also himself, the entire leadership structure would be overthrown. leaving only disgrace. I already understand the situation, Hanlon replied, his voice cold but calculating. Turner is currently suspended. He will be the one to bear all responsibility in this case. We will make sure that all charges stay with him and not anyone else in the department. The voice on the other side immediately responded, this case is not just about Turner. The public wants a bigger answer, and they won't stop until they dig up the whole truth. You need to control the situation, otherwise everything will sink. Hanlon remained silent, well aware that this was unlike any situation before. If all the secrets were revealed, the consequences would be uncontrollable. Let me handle Turner, Hanlon said at last, his voice low and dangerous. He won't say anything. And what if he says? The voice on the other end was a little hesitant, a little scared. Hanlon's face turned dark. Then I will make sure he has no chance to come back. At the FBI office, Margaret was sitting at her desk, carefully reviewing the files she had collected. Every detail of citizen complaints, evidence of wrongdoing, and efforts to cover up these acts are clearly visible. It all points to one. Margaret has been following Hanlon since the beginning of her covert operation. He is careful, very careful in every step, but his subtle traces are still left. Recorded conversations, how he dismissed complaints involving trusted officers, including Turner. Margaret knew that if they could get Turner to open up, they could drag Hanlon down with him. Margaret's phone rang, and she saw Harris's name. It's Margaret, she said as she answered the phone. Harris's voice was visibly tense. We're in trouble. Turner refused to testify. Margaret frowned, feeling an overwhelming sense of disappointment. He refuses to cooperate? Not really, Harris replied. He was afraid of Hanlon. He knew that if he told the truth, it would all be over for him. Hanlon won't leave him alone. Margaret was cold. She had guessed that Hanlon might be trying to defend himself, but directly threatening Turner's life was an extremely dangerous escalation. We need to move Turner to safety before confronting Hanlon, she said, standing up from her desk. If Hanlon is desperate, he may do something reckless. We need to get Turner to a secure Federation facility tomorrow morning. Harris nodded. Turner remains in the city jail. Tonight. Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. The city detention center was still within Hanlon's reach, and she knew well the power of figures like Hanlon, who could make people disappear even within the four walls of the police department. I'm going to prison, Margaret said, hastily grabbing her coat. I will ensure his safety until the transfer. If Hanlon wants to act, I will be there. Harris hesitated for a moment, then sighed. Be careful, Hill. Hanlon is dangerous when cornered. I know, Margaret replied, her voice calm but filled with tension. And that's why I have to do this. That night, Margaret arrived at the city detention center in a silent, tense atmosphere threatening to explode. The area was quieter than usual. The protest outside had dispersed, but inside, an ominous silence filled the space. The officers moved quietly, their heads bowed, as if carrying the burden of failure and worry. Margaret went down to the holding area where Turner was being held until the next morning, when he would be moved to a safer place. Margaret stopped in front of Turner's cell, where he sat with his head bowed, his eyes filled with confusion and regret. She stood there for a long moment, looking at him through the bars, realizing that this was a fight not just for Turner, but for the entire system, and she would have to go to the extreme to bring true justice. Margaret Hill entered the detention area, her eyes serious and alert. The guard on duty glanced at her warily, recognizing her as the FBI agent who had overthrown Officer Alex Turner, who was now sitting in his cell, face down, looking at the floor as if we have lost all hope. Hair disheveled, eyes bloodshot as if he had been awake, Alex looked up as Margaret approached, confusion and insecurity shining in his eyes. Are you still here? Alex asked, horror flashing across his face as he saw Margaret leaning against the bars. I'm not sure if you'll make it through the night, she said, still looking straight at him with a mixture of sympathy and determination. Alex gritted his teeth, suppressed his emotions, and said nothing. Margaret sighed, looking at him intently. I know you're afraid of Hanlon, she said softly but firmly. But this is your chance to do the right thing. He might even be able to salvage something of his dignity. Don't let fear control you anymore. Alex looked up, his eyes shining with a deep fear for the first time, a fear that could not be hidden. I can't, he said softly, his voice lost. You don't understand. Hanlon won't let me live. He will kill me before I can tell. Margaret leaned in, her eyes firm, her voice soft but convincing. Ryan, you are in danger. Hanlon will do everything to silence you. But if you help us, we can protect you. We could take him down. This is your only chance to be free from this nightmare. Alex still hesitated, his hands shaking as he stroked his messy hair. Margaret could see the inner struggle within him, between deep fear and a faint glimmer of hope. I'll be back tomorrow morning to move you, Margaret said, stepping back from the bars. You will be safe. As she turned away, Alex's voice rang out, weak but sincere. Agent Hill. Margaret stopped walking. Turn around, Alex's shoulders slumped. Thank you for giving me a chance. Margaret nodded silently and left, her heart filled with anxiety as she thought about what needed to be done next. Early in the morning, when the streetlights were still shining in the darkness, Margaret drove through the empty streets. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind busy with thoughts of the confrontation with Hanlon and the dark truths that Turner had revealed last night. We're all dirty. Turner's words haunted her the whole way home. It turns out that corruption and abuse of power run deeper than she thought, going far beyond Hanlon and Turner, and now the entire police department is under suspicion. The closer she got to the city detention center, the stronger the bad premonition in Margaret's heart became. The detention area was strangely quiet tonight, lacking the usual bustle. A heavy silence fell, only the sound of her footsteps echoing down the long hallway as she walked towards the holding area where Turner was locked up. Gently pushing open the door of the detention area, Margaret clearly felt the stuffy air and the overwhelming sense of insecurity. As she approached Turner's cell, her heart sank. Turner's cell door was ajar. Instinctively, Margaret's hand moved towards the gun at her hip, preparing to face the unexpected. Looking inside, she froze. Turner lay motionless on the floor, his eyes staring blankly into space, as if life had left him. A wave of terror washed over him as she moved forward, kneeling down to check his pulse. There was no heartbeat, no breathing. Turner's body was cold. Margaret tried to suppress the feeling of nausea when she realized the harsh truth. Turner was dead. Margaret stepped back, her heart heavy. This was not an accident, but the message that Hanlon sent. Hanlon chose to suppress Turner to suppress his testimony. With shaking legs, Margaret pulled out her phone and quickly called Harris. When he picked up the phone, his voice was filled with worry. Margaret, what happened? Harris asked, his voice urgent. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to stay calm as she replied, Turner is dead. Hanlon was ahead of us. A heavy silence enveloped the other end of the line before Harris spoke, his voice mixed with doubt and indignation. How did this happen? Margaret replied, her voice heavy with disappointment. I just saw him, cold and emotionless. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious injuries, but this was not a natural death, Harris. Turner was scared, but he was prepared to expose everything about Hanlon. And now he's dead. I'm sure Hanlon made the first move. Another pause from Harris, longer, carrying the weight of doubt. Do we have anything to accuse Hanlon of? Nothing immediate yet, Margaret said, her voice cold as steel. But we must act quickly. Hanlon is cleaning up the trail, and Turner is the only one who can tie everything together. Harris took a deep breath, determination evident as he spoke. Okay, I will call the team. We will not let this go. Margaret turned off the phone, her hands shaking slightly as she stuffed it into her pocket, her eyes scanning Turner's motionless body one last time. Anger and pain welled up in my heart. Yes, Turner was part of the corruption, but he helped her. He was the key to taking down Hanlon, exposing everything that was being covered up in the division. But now that he's gone, the journey ahead becomes even more obscure. She turned away, determined to go deeper into the next steps. Hanlon made a mistake. He was silent, but also revealed his desperation. Desperate people often make mistakes, and Margaret will make sure Hanlon pays for each of them. As she walked out of the detention area, Margaret caught a glimpse of a few officers on the morning shift. their faces tense, their eyes filled with worry as she passed by. Via rumors are spreading, and Turner's death won't be hidden for long. Margaret understood that she had to act quickly because the investigation was now officially under federal jurisdiction and the media would soon be pouring in. She needed to make sure they had enough evidence to charge Hanlon before he could clear his tracks. Margaret's phone vibrates, a text from an agent on the team. They've collected Hanlon's phone records. He made a series of calls last night. Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken. This was an important clue she could use to incriminate Hanlon. She returned to the FBI office, her team ready to take position. Harris was at the center of this effort, coordinating every action to lock up the evidence. They scoured every document, video recording, anything that could link Hanlon to Turner's death. "Harris," Margaret called out as she entered. "Do we have any news yet?" "It seems there is," Harris replied, his eyes cold. "Hanlon called a number last night. We have tracked down its owner, a man known to law enforcement as the Executioner." Margaret felt a burst of adrenaline. The Executioner, a famous person in the underground world, specializing in violent cleanup cases. "This is the sign we need. If we can tie this guy to Turner's death, we'll have Hanlon." Her voice was tougher than ever. "Let's capture Hanlon before he can run away." As the FBI team readied, Margaret clearly felt the loss of Turner's death, but it made her even more determined. Hanlon thought he had won by silencing Turner, blocking the investigation. But Margaret won't let him get away that easily. She lost Turner, but this time she won't lose. The next morning, with the wheels of justice in place, Margaret's team located the Executioner and ordered his arrest. This person almost immediately confessed the truth, confirming that Hanlon had ordered Turner's death to prevent him from testifying. Hanlon made a fatal mistake, and now it's time for him to pay the price. Margaret stood outside the police precinct, taking a deep breath in the morning chill. Next to her, Harris and other agents prepared to make an arrest. They walked through the door with their FBI badges prominently displayed, leaving no doubt as to the power they represented. The officers' faces turned from shock to panic when they realized the scale of this raid. Hanlon's office is at the end of the hallway. The door is closed, the curtains are drawn. Margaret's heart pounded as she approached, feeling the weight of the moment on her shoulders. Harris knocked on the door, his voice authoritative. "Lieutenant Hanlon, FBI, open the door." There was a long, tense silence. Finally, the door slowly opened. Hanlon appeared with a calm face, but dark eyes showing stubbornness or perhaps resignation. He looked at Margaret, then Harris, and the agents behind him. "What's up?" Hanlon asked, his voice full of challenge. "What is this?" "You are under arrest for murder and obstruction of justice." Margaret stepped forward, her voice filled with determination. "And for your role in covering up widespread corruption in this department." Hanlon was silent for a long moment, his eyes silently passing from Margaret to Harris. Finally, he moved aside to let the agents enter the office. Margaret observed his tense movements, his hands clenched into fists, but he still did not resist. Harris stepped forward, slowly pulled out a pair of handcuffs, looking straight into Hanlon's eyes. This time, Hanlon's jaw clenched, but he still turned around and reached back, accepting the cold iron cuffs locked tightly around his wrists. The sound of handcuffs echoed in the small space, and Margaret closely watched every move, waiting for a protest from Hanlon. But he remained silent, not saying a word as he was led out of the office. Margaret stood back, looking at this room, the center of corruption. This is where Hanlon staged a cover-up of complaints, where reports were manipulated, where officers like Steele were protected. The atmosphere is heavy with deception and power that has been abused over the years. Margaret began searching around the office, flipping through drawers and stacks of documents, trying to find anything that could strengthen the case. Harris took Hanlon's computer, but Margaret was looking for something more tangible, something that would clarify Hanlon's profound nature. Suddenly, her finger touched a small, leather-bound notebook hidden in the bottom drawer. Opening it, she was surprised to see names, numbers, bribes, privileges. A notebook meticulously records every corruption case in which Hanlon was involved. Margaret's heart pounded as she turned each page. This was the last piece of the puzzle they needed. Outside the area, a crowd had gathered, Press cameras flashed, and reporters scrambled to capture the moment. As Hamlin was let out in handcuffs, the crowd erupted. Some shouted in anger, while others cheered with relief and doubt. After years of repression, the community is now witnessing the fall of a man who once held power within the system that protected itself. Although Hamlin kept a poker face, Margaret could see fear in his eyes as he was led away. Harris approached Margaret on the steps, his face a little tired but full of satisfaction. "We did it," he said softly. Margaret nodded slightly, but this victory brought a bittersweet feeling. Deposing Hamlin is a step forward, but the fight is not over yet. There are still officers who have created conditions for corruption to develop, who have turned a blind eye to the abuse of power. "The investigation will continue," Margaret said, "and we will root out every last one." The crowd outside chanted, demanding justice, accountability, and zero tolerance. The enveloping energy is proof that this is not just about catching one corrupt officer, but about an entire system that needs to change. That night, Margaret sat alone in her apartment, the city lights flickering through the window. Fatigue overwhelmed her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. The phone on her desk vibrated, and she saw a text from Harris. "We made a difference today. Rest, Margaret." She smiled weakly, leaning back in her chair. This was a long war, but they did something meaningful. They overthrew a man who thought he was untouchable. Tomorrow, work will continue. But tonight, Margaret allows herself to rest, confident that the fight for justice is far from over, and she is ready for whatever comes next.